There's just over a day until American voters head to the polls to pick the next president of the United States. The 2020 presidential election has not been without unexpected twists and turns along the way due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's growing concern that Election Day itself may not be so straightforward. The virus has pushed an unprecedented number of Americans to send in their ballots by post, more than 97 million voters, which is over two-thirds of the 2016 electorate. But mail-in ballots do take longer to count than in-person ones, so some observers say a clear winner may not emerge on election night for some states. There could be days of uncertainty to follow, especially with President Donald Trump having said that he may not accept the election results, also making unsubstantiated claims against the legitimacy of the election itself and actively encouraging his supporters to observe polling locations for fraud and irregularities. To add to the uncertainty, there have also been warnings that foreign powers may scale up cyber attacks to create disruption to the voting and vote counting process. We discussed some of the things that could go wrong in the immediate lead up to and following Election Day in America. For this, we connect with Dr. Aubrey Jewett, Professor of Political Science at the University of Central Florida. It's lovely to see you today, sir.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on the phone. And we also have Mr. Gopal Ratnam, Senior Staff Writer at the Congressional Quarterly and Roll Call, joining us all the way from Washington, D.C. It's lovely to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start with you, Dr. Jewett. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed an unprecedented number of American voters to mail in their ballots, which some say could delay election results, especially in the battleground states. How long do you think we should actually prepare ourselves to wait for all the votes to be counted this year?
Well, I think it's possible it could be by the end of the week or even longer, depending not only on how close the election is, but how long it takes some states to count their ballots. Florida is actually pretty good at this. We've been using mail ballots for over a decade quite extensively, and we allow the supervisors of election to begin counting those mail ballots when they come in, so that on election night, most of them will have been counted. But there are a number of states that do not allow counting of those mail ballots until Election Day. And so, for instance, Pennsylvania and Michigan and a few other states, it could be days and days before they actually end up counting the ballots.
And Mr. Ratnam, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, do you think we're in for quite a long wait?
I agree. In fact, besides just the delay in the counting itself, I think there are going to be substantial legal challenges from both sides on the mail ballots being counted and the in-person votes being counted, because there's also likely that quite a few voters who asked for a mail-in ballot but did not send it back in time, maybe also voting on a provisional basis, which means they get a ballot, they vote, and then the voting authorities, election officials, have to decide which of their two ballots, if they've cast one by mail or one in person, is legitimate. So all of that, like Professor Jewett said, adds to potentially the results not being clear for a good 2 weeks at least.
So it looks like a lot of the posts in the US has been held up as well, so potentially some problems there as well if they don't reach the ballots in time for Election Day. Now, Dr. Jewett, early vote totals, they've now ticked past 97 million, and that's over 70% of the 2016 turnout, according to data by the US Elections Project. And of course, more of the early voters tend to be Democrats, and they do currently have a big lead in the early vote over the Republican Party. But the Biden campaign doesn't seem to be too reassured by this, because early indicators, as history has shown, can be quite wrong. And while the Republicans themselves, they seem to be quite confident that they can turn the tables with the turnout on Election Day. So the big question here really is who captures the new or undecided voters at this point? And, well, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, that is the big question of the day, along with who can mobilize their core supporters, is who can really rally these new voters, these first-time voters. And there is some mixed evidence on this. On the one hand, when you look at early voting across the states, and particularly early mail voting, Democrats have taken a big lead in a number of states, including Florida. But then once we began to do in-person voting in a number of states, including Florida, we actually saw Republicans begin to catch up. And so that's one thing. And then the other thing is we also have some mixed signals about some trends in voter registration. For instance, in two critical battleground states, Florida and Pennsylvania, we know over the last couple of years, Republicans have actually gained registered voters at a much faster pace than Democrats. And so you sort of combine all these things, and it leaves a pretty cloudy forecast. It's very difficult to say who's got the lead. I will add, the last thing I'll point out is that I think Democrats are right to be a little nervous. The polls do show that Biden is up, but they know that 4 years ago the poll showed Hillary Clinton was up. And then because of a huge turnout surge on Election Day, Donald Trump became president.
And so it really is a battle. Please go ahead.
I would also add to that unlike some states like Florida, which have had established mail-in voting systems for some time, there are quite a few states where mail-in voting has been introduced for the first time in a very rapid, rushed manner, I would say, particularly in a state like Pennsylvania. And so it's hard to say in some of those key battleground states, how many of the early voters are Democrats and how many in-person voters are likely to be Republicans. There's likely to be a mix because I think some states are still struggling to sort of communicate to their voters how exactly mail-in ballots work, what the process is, and when they can be counted, and so on.
So really, it's a very fierce battle to capture those very narrow margins. And, well, Mr. Ratnam, we've heard reports of foreign powers like Iran sending threatening messages to Democrat voters and also Russia having access to voter information. And intelligence officials, they have been warning throughout the year that foreign powers will use covert and overt influence measures to sway US voters. What do these measures entail, and to what extent do you think they've been successful in the final days of campaigning?
I think one of the big differences in 2020 compared with 2016 and even the midterm elections of 2018 is the extent of preparation by the US intelligence agencies, by the Department of Homeland Security, by the state and local officials who are a lot better prepared for a cyber attack or a foreign interference than they were in the past. And we should also remind viewers that in the United States, the elections are held at the local level and not by the federal government. So that means as many as 9,000 different jurisdictions across the country run the elections, even though they are federal elections. And so the federal government's role has largely been to help and assist on a voluntary basis with the local officials, helping make sure that their computer systems, electronic systems, voting machines and voting machinery are free from cybersecurity, cyber attacks. But like you pointed out in the case of Iran, the information that some of these countries have been able to take are public information. Voter registration in some cases for information is available publicly, and that is now perhaps in the hands of some of these foreign adversaries. And one of the advantages also of because of the pandemic and because of the very high number of voters taking to early voting and mail-in voting, is the crowd on or the crowding on the election day has been spread out. I've been speaking with election officials and U.S. intelligence officials in Washington, and they point out that instead of just focusing all of their efforts on one day, election day, which is tomorrow, that they've been able to spread out their capacity over the last almost 40 days. And so that has eased the technical kind of hurdles, and there are likely to be a lot fewer challenges tomorrow because a lot of voters have already voted, and the number of people actually showing up to vote tomorrow physically could be a smaller number than in the past. So I think there's some optimism in the US among US officials that means they will have a more manageable problem tomorrow than in the past.
Right, so over 97 million Americans who've already voted, and Florida being one of them. Florida saw a record early voting turnout, and well, where you're at right now, Dr. Jewett, Florida is, of course, one of the key battleground states that both Trump and Biden need to swing in their favor. And both are seeming to have a bit of trouble capturing certain demographics, though, given the diversity of the population there. So why is Florida so important in the U.S. presidential elections?
Well, Florida is really one of the most important states in presidential elections. And that's because we do not use a national popular vote to select our president. Instead, we use a system called the Electoral College, where each state is given a certain number of votes based on their population. And Florida gets 29 of those electoral votes because it is such a large state. And Florida is also one of the largest competitive states. Many of our states are very Republican and always vote Republican, or very Democratic and always vote Democratic. But there's about 10 or 15 that are called swing states. Florida is one, and it is the largest swing state. And the other reason I think that Florida is so important is that we have a track record of having very close elections and voting for the winner. The last 6 presidential elections, Florida has voted for the winner each time. 3 times it was a Democrat, and 3 times it was a Republican. So we have gone back and forth between the parties. And all those times, the winner, on average, only won by about 2% of the vote in Florida. So for all those reasons, and mostly because we're just a large competitive state, Florida tends to be the most important swing state in U.S. elections.
And what's quite unique about this election, it seems that the race gap has been narrowing to some sense, because while Joe Biden, he's having a bit of trouble capturing Hispanic voters who don't have a Cuban background, for instance, and it seems black voters aren't as inclined to vote for him as they did for Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. Would you say he does have a chance there to really flip the numbers and swing the favor towards his presidency on the last day of campaigning? Who do you think is winning Florida at the moment?
Well, I really think it's a toss-up. If you look at the last, say, 8 or 10 polls that have been done just over the last week in Florida, Biden is ahead in several, but usually just by 2 or 3 points. But Trump has been also ahead. And so it really is a toss-up. I will say that Biden does seem like he's doing better with 2 important demographic groups. That would be seniors. 4 years ago, Donald Trump won seniors in Florida by almost 20%. It was about 17%. And some of the pre-election polls have showed that Biden is doing much better among seniors, and it seems because of the COVID-19 pandemic. A number of seniors don't think that Donald Trump has done enough to fight the pandemic. And, of course, as we know, seniors have been hit disproportionately hard by the COVID pandemic and death, in fact. And the other group is Hispanics. Trump is actually doing a little better with Hispanics this time around. He did quite well with Cubans last time, although he lost Hispanics in Florida overall. But there's been several polls that have suggested that Trump is actually almost even or maybe slightly ahead of Biden. And so each of the candidates is doing a little better with one group than they did 4 years ago. But that means that basically Florida is deadlocked once again.
And, well, Dr. Jewett, now President Donald Trump, he has said that he may not accept the result of the election, and he's actually urged some of his voters to observe the polling stations. And now there are growing concerns that there may be violence or intimidation by militias on election day. How real are these threats? And what if President Trump goes by what he says and doesn't accept the results?
Yeah, well, first on voter intimidation, let's hope that doesn't happen. I know in Florida we have 67 supervisors of election, and they are prepared for things like that. And they also are going to be working with local law enforcement to make sure things like that don't happen, and that every American, every Floridian can go, if they want to vote in person on Election Day, can go to their local precinct and do so freely and without fear. And so let's hope that that's what happens. In terms of President Trump saying he won't accept the results, I definitely agree with my colleague on air here that there is a high probability that there will be a lot of lawsuits filed, during and after this election. And so that's one thing. It's one thing to say, you're going to have lawsuits to try to make sure that the ballots are counted correctly or this kind of thing. But to just say you're not going to accept the results of the election, I mean, well, Trump can say that, President Trump can say that all he wants, but the bottom line is, if he loses the election after lawsuits are settled and the votes are counted, if he loses, then Joe Biden will be sworn in on January 20th, and President Trump can not like it or, can like it or not accept it or whatever he wants. But we will have a transition of power. I'm quite confident of that, regardless of his personal feelings, if he loses. Now, of course, the possibility is that he still could win. Let's make that perfectly clear as well. It happened 4 years ago, surprised a lot of people, and it could happen again.
Well, it seems that controversy.
And also, I would add that. I mean, that in that scenario, though, the difference really is going to be the margin of victory by either candidate. If in the scenario that you posed, where President Trump loses and the margin is very slim, that is going to lead to a lot more unknown uncertainties than some of the other scenarios. And in fact, some of the things that intelligence officials are worried about is the biggest amount of disinformation is actually coming from the president and the White House and the Republican Party. And you earlier referenced Russia and Iran. I mean, these are actors who are basically, amplifying the disinformation from the White House and from the president. And that is actually one of the biggest weaknesses that I think most officials are worried about, because that's going to lead a lot of Americans to war.
So national security experts, as you have mentioned, they've actually warned that foreign powers may launch attacks on and even after November 3rd to actually disrupt the 2020 election. I mean, it was reported in Georgia that there was a ransomware attack that would significantly slow down vote counting. Do you expect such attempts to be made on election day, possibly afterwards? And have you noticed any changes in strategy this year by Russian trolls or foreign powers attempting intervention that kind of stood out to you?
From what I understand, I think most of American officials believe that small attacks like the one that you mentioned, or a defacing of the website, or what is called a denial of service attack, those are almost impossible to stop. But the idea is that if you have backup systems, then you can recover fast from those kinds of attacks. But I think the larger issue is it's less of a cyber attack or a ransomware attack and disinformation campaigns. So that is actually a more difficult problem to solve, especially if President Trump says, I don't believe the results in Pennsylvania, I don't believe the results in Florida. And then, Russian trolls have basically taken to amplifying those messages on social media, like Twitter, like Facebook and others. And that poses a much more difficult problem than trying to solve a cyber attack or a ransomware attack.
Well, it looks like the controversy won't be dying down right after the election. There's going to be some period of uncertainty, it seems. But, well, we'll have to wait and see, of course. But this is where we have to wrap up the discussion. That was Dr. Aubrey Jewett, Professor of Political Science at the University of Central Florida, and Gopal Ratnam, Senior Staff Writer at the Congressional Quarterly and Roll Call, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, both of you, for your insights.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And to our viewers, thank you as always for watching. We'll be back at the same time here in South Korea. Until then, have a great day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.